Stop resisting. The voice cut through the night like a siren, sharp and final, even though Marcus Reed hadn't moved an inch. His cheek hovered inches above the warm asphalt, heat rising in slow waves from the road beneath him, carrying the faint smell of rubber and dust. Red and blue lights pulsed across the storefront windows, reflecting in broken fragments on the glass, flickering across Marcus's face like a warning he couldn't escape. His breath came steady, controlled, just like his mother had taught him. Count it out. Don't panic. Don't give them a reason. Around him, the world didn't stop, but it shifted. Tires rolled slower. Conversations dropped into murmurs. Phones lifted into the air, their tiny lenses blinking like distant stars, capturing everything without saying a word. Marcus kept his hands visible, fingers spread against the pavement, his palms tingling from the rough surface pressing back. He could hear the officer behind him moving, fabric brushing, radio crackling with static, a voice somewhere asking for confirmation, for backup, for something official to justify what was already happening. Marcus swallowed, his throat dry, but his voice, when it came, stayed quiet. "I'm not doing anything wrong, sir." The words didn't rise. They didn't fight. They simply existed, steady as his breathing, carried into the open air where no one answered them. A car idled nearby, its headlights casting a pale beam that stretched across the street, cutting through the flashing lights and landing right on Marcus's shoulder, outlining him like evidence. He felt every second pass, not fast, not slow, just heavy, like time itself had weight. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered, too low to make out, and someone else shifted their stance, sneakers scraping lightly against concrete. No one stepped forward. No one stepped back. The officer's presence loomed, not loud, not explosive, just firm and unyielding, like a wall Marcus couldn't see but could feel pressing closer. The night air cooled against his neck, mixing with the lingering warmth of the road beneath him, trapping him in a space that felt smaller than it should have been. Marcus blinked once, eyes catching the reflection of the flashing lights again, and for a moment, everything looked unreal, like a scene paused between frames, waiting for something to break it open. But nothing did. Not yet. The silence stretched, tight and fragile, as if the entire street was holding its breath, waiting for a single word, a single shift, something that would decide how this moment would end. Marcus had learned early that stillness could be mistaken for guilt, but movement could be mistaken for threat, so he chose the narrow space in between, the kind of control that came from years of quiet instruction and careful observation. Just 3 hours earlier, the world had felt ordinary in a way that now seemed distant, almost unreachable. The bell above the corner store door had chimed softly as he stepped out, the familiar scent of detergent and cardboard still clinging to his hoodie from the evening shift. Inside, he had spent the last 4 hours stocking shelves, aligning labels, making sure every row faced forward like it mattered, because to him, it did. Mr. Alvarez had nodded once before locking up, a silent approval Marcus had come to value more than words. It was a small job, minimum wage, just under $8 an hour after taxes, but it helped cover groceries, helped keep the lights steady at home, helped his mother breathe a little easier at the end of each month. Marcus adjusted the strap of his backpack as he walked down Maple Avenue, the streetlights casting long, steady beams that stretched across the sidewalk in warm yellow pools. He kept to the same route every night, past the gas station, past the closed diner with its flickering neon sign, past the bus stop where no one ever waited this late. Routine mattered. Predictability felt safe. His mother had always said, "Keep your head down, keep your hands visible, and do not give anyone a reason to misunderstand you." He had taken those words seriously, carrying them like a second set of rules layered quietly over everything else. Even now, with the hum of distant traffic and the low buzz of power lines overhead, those rules echoed in his mind, steady and constant. Marcus was not the kind of kid who looked for trouble. At school, he sat near the front, took notes in neat, careful lines, answered when called on, but never louder than necessary. His teachers described him as focused, respectful, the kind of student who did not demand attention but earned it slowly over time. He had plans, not loud ones, not the kind people bragged about, but steady ones. Graduate. Apply to state college. Study something practical, something that would let him build a life that did not depend on chance. It was not about ambition as much as it was about stability, about making sure his future did not slip through his fingers the way it had for so many people he had seen growing up. As he reached the intersection, he had paused, waiting for the signal to change, hands loosely at his sides, backpack resting evenly across his shoulders. A patrol car had rolled past then, slow, almost casual, its headlights sweeping across him for just a second longer than necessary. Marcus had felt it, that brief moment of being seen too closely, like a spotlight that lingered just enough to leave a mark. He had kept his posture relaxed, eyes forward, breathing even. The light had turned green. He had stepped forward. And now, back on the pavement with the night pressing in around him, that small moment replayed in fragments, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift that had somehow led him here, surrounded by strangers, under flashing lights, holding on to the same rules that had always guided him, even as the ground beneath him felt less certain than ever before. Officer Daniel Hayes had been on patrol for nearly 11 hours when the call came through, the kind of shift that stretched long past comfort and settled into something heavier, something dull and persistent behind the eyes. The radio clipped at his shoulder crackled with short bursts of coded language, half-finished reports, voices overlapping in a rhythm he had learned to follow without thinking. Earlier that evening, he had sat in his cruiser outside a convenience store, engine idling, watching the reflection of fluorescent lights shimmer across the windshield while finishing a lukewarm cup of coffee that tasted more like routine than anything else. He had chosen this job years ago believing in structure, in order, in the idea that rules, when followed, could keep things from falling apart. But years on the street had worn those beliefs into something less clear, replacing certainty with instinct, and instinct with habit. When dispatch mentioned a possible match for a recent report, his body reacted before his mind fully caught up, posture straightening, hand adjusting the wheel, eyes scanning with a sharper edge. He had seen the description too many times before, vague enough to fit almost anyone, specific enough to justify a second look. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, the streetlights lined up in a steady row, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like quiet signals. Then he saw Marcus, walking alone, backpack slung over one shoulder, moving at an even pace that did not change when the patrol car slowed beside him. For a brief second, Hayes hesitated, something small and almost unnoticeable flickering beneath the surface, but training filled the gap quickly, guiding his actions forward. He stepped out of the cruiser, the door closing with a firm click that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness of the street. "Hey, hold up a second," he called, his tone measured, practiced, the kind that expected compliance before it even arrived. Marcus had stopped, just like that, turning slightly, hands visible, posture open, doing everything right in a situation that did not feel right. Hayes approached, eyes scanning, noting details, building a picture that fit the call in his mind even if the edges did not align perfectly. Questions followed, short and direct, each one narrowing the space between suspicion and assumption. The longer the moment stretched, the more it settled into something fixed, something that felt less like a question and more like a conclusion. Now, standing over Marcus in the glow of flashing lights and quiet tension, Hayes felt the weight of every second pressing forward, not as doubt, but as certainty built on repetition. Around them, the street held its breath, the low hum of engines and distant voices forming a backdrop that never quite broke the silence. Hayes adjusted his stance slightly, the movement small but deliberate, as if reinforcing the situation in place. To him, this was procedure, a continuation of decisions made countless times before, guided by instinct sharpened over years. But beneath that surface, buried deep and almost unnoticed, something else lingered, not yet formed into thought, not yet strong enough to interrupt, just a quiet presence waiting for the moment when certainty might begin to crack. Marcus could feel the moment tightening, not through force, but through expectation, like the air itself had decided what this situation was supposed to become before he ever had a chance to explain it. He kept his voice level, careful, each word placed like it mattered more than usual, because here, it did. "I was just heading home from work," he said, eyes fixed somewhere just past the edge of the flashing lights, not challenging, not avoiding, just steady. The red and blue reflections moved across his vision in slow waves, distorting the edges of everything around him, turning the street into something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to him anymore. Officer Hayes did not respond right away. Instead, he watched, his gaze moving over Marcus with a practiced precision, as if searching for something that would confirm what had already been decided. The radio at his shoulder crackled again, a distant voice asking for status, for updates, for clarity that had not yet been given. Hayes pressed the button briefly, murmured something low and official, then released it, letting the silence settle back in like it had never left. Marcus shifted his fingers slightly against the pavement, not enough to draw attention, just enough to keep the feeling in them from fading completely. The rough texture pressed back into his skin, grounding him in a way nothing else could right now. He remembered his mother's voice again, softer this time, almost like a memory echoing through the noise. Stay calm. Stay respectful. Make it home. That last part lingered longer than the rest. Around them, more people had gathered, not close enough to interfere, but not far enough to ignore. A man stood near the curb, arms folded, watching with a tight expression he did not quite understand. A woman held her phone up, her face illuminated by the screen, capturing every second without blinking. Someone else shifted from foot to foot, uncertain, as if waiting for permission to react. Marcus could feel their presence without looking, the weight of observation pressing down just as much as the situation itself. "Can I see some identification?" Hayes finally asked, his tone even, controlled, but carrying an edge that made it less of a request and more of a step already in motion. Marcus nodded slowly, careful with the movement, mindful of how easily anything could be misunderstood. "It is in my backpack," he said, voice still steady, still measured. He waited, not reaching, not moving, holding the moment exactly where it was until he was told otherwise. Hayes studied him again, a pause stretching between them that felt longer than it should have been, like time was hesitating before deciding which direction to take. Then, with a slight motion of his hand, he gave a short instruction, controlled and precise, guiding what came next. Marcus followed it exactly, each movement deliberate, each second stretching into something larger than itself. The night remained suspended around them, the hum of engines, the flicker of lights, the quiet tension in every breath forming a space where anything could shift, but nothing had yet. And in that fragile stillness, Marcus held on to the only thing he had left to control, the quiet certainty of who he was, even as everything around him tried to define it for him. The zipper of Marcus's backpack sounded louder than it should have, a slow, deliberate pull that seemed to stretch across the entire street, as if every ear had tuned into that single motion. He kept his movements controlled, careful not to rush, careful not to hesitate, finding that narrow line again where nothing could be mistaken for something else. The fabric shifted as he reached inside, fingers brushing against the edges of notebooks, the smooth surface of a calculator, the folded receipt from the store still tucked in the front pocket. He found his wallet and paused for half a second, not long enough to draw attention, just enough to steady his breath before bringing it out into the open where it could be seen clearly. The flashing lights reflected off the worn leather, casting brief streaks of red and blue across his hand like signals he could not ignore. Slowly, Officer Hayes said, his voice calm but firm, reinforcing the rhythm of the moment as if guiding a process that had already been decided step by step. Marcus nodded once, small and precise, then opened the wallet with both hands visible, angling it outward so there was no confusion, no question about what he was doing. The identification card sat neatly in its slot, his name printed in clean, black letters, the photo taken under fluorescent school lighting that flattened everything into something official and distant. Marcus Reed, 17. The details were simple, ordinary, the kind that should have ended the moment before it had even begun. Hayes leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to read, to confirm, to compare the face in front of him with the image in the card, with the description that still lingered somewhere in the back of his mind. The radio crackled again, louder this time, another voice cutting through with a question that hung in the air unanswered for a second too long. Hayes did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the card, his movement steady, practiced, taking it without hurry, without acknowledgement, as if this was just another piece in a sequence that had not yet reached its end. Marcus felt the absence of it instantly, a small but noticeable shift, like something grounding had been removed. He kept his hands where they were, open, visible, exactly as before. Around them, the crowd shifted again, a ripple moving through the small group of onlookers. A man near the curb took a step closer, then stopped, uncertainty holding him in place. The woman with the phone adjusted her angle, capturing the exchange with quiet determination, her screen glowing brighter against the darkened street. Someone whispered something sharp, almost questioning, but it faded before it fully formed into words. Hayes glanced at the card once more, then back at Marcus, his expression unchanged, still fixed somewhere between focus and assumption. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, even though the answer had already been given. Marcus swallowed, the dryness in his throat returning, but his voice stayed even. "From work, sir. The grocery store on Maple." He did not add anything else. He did not need to. The truth sat plainly between them, simple and complete, but the moment did not move forward the way it should have. Instead, it held, suspended in that same fragile tension, as if waiting for something else to tip the balance. The lights continued to pulse, the engines continued to hum, and Marcus stood there, steady and still, holding on to his composure as tightly as he could, even as the space around him felt less and less certain with each passing second. For a moment, everything slowed down, not because anything had changed, but because nothing had. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, red washing over the pavement, blue cutting across the storefront windows, each pulse reflecting off the badge on Officer Hayes's chest in brief, sharp glints. Marcus stood exactly where he had been, his hands still open, his posture unchanged, but inside, he could feel the quiet weight of the moment settling deeper, pressing into something he could not name, but could not ignore. The night air brushed lightly against his skin, carrying a faint chill that mixed with the lingering warmth rising from the asphalt beneath his feet. It felt like standing between two temperatures, neither one fully taking over, just existing side by side in a balance that could shift at any second. Hayes held the identification card in his hand, his thumb resting along its edge, not moving, not returning it, just holding it there as if the answer it contained needed more time to become clear. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting Marcus again, and for a brief second, something flickered there, something quieter than certainty, something that did not fit neatly into the pattern he was used to following. It did not last long, but it was there. Around them, the small crowd had grown still, the earlier murmurs fading into a silence that felt almost intentional, like everyone present understood, without saying it, that this moment mattered more than it should have. A car passed in the distance, its tires humming softly against the road, the sound stretching thin before disappearing entirely. Somewhere nearby, a door closed, the sharp click echoing once before being swallowed by the night. Marcus drew in a slow breath, not deep, not shallow, just enough to remind himself that he was still here, still grounded in something real despite how unreal everything felt. He could feel his heartbeat, steady and consistent, not racing, not panicked, just present, marking time in a way nothing else could. Hayes shifted slightly, the movement small but noticeable, his stance adjusting as if the ground beneath him had changed in some subtle way. The radio at his shoulder crackled again, but this time he did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked at Marcus, really looked, not just scanning, not just assessing, but seeing something that had been there all along and somehow overlooked. The streetlights cast long shadows behind them, stretching across the pavement in uneven lines that blurred at the edges, merging with the darkness beyond. It was quiet in a way that felt heavier than noise, a silence filled with expectation, with questions that had not yet been asked, with answers that had not yet been given. Marcus did not speak. He did not need to. Everything that needed to be said was already there, in the way he stood, in the steadiness of his gaze, in the quiet refusal to become anything other than who he was. And in that stillness, something began to shift, not loud, not sudden, but real, like the first crack in something that had always seemed unbreakable. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like a ripple moving through still water, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. From somewhere behind the small crowd, a voice cut through, not loud, but sharp enough to land exactly where it needed to. Wait, wait, that is Marcus Reed. The words hung in the air, uncertain at first, like the speaker was not sure they should have said it out loud. A few heads turned, eyes searching for the source, but the voice came again, stronger this time, carried by recognition rather than hesitation. That is Judge Reed's son. The effect was immediate, not dramatic, not explosive, but precise. The kind of shift that does not need volume to change everything. Officer Hayes did not move right away, but something in his posture altered, almost too small to notice, like a structure adjusting under new weight. His grip on the identification card tightened just slightly, his eyes flicking down to the name again, then back up to Marcus with a different kind of focus, one that was no longer built on assumption alone. Around them, the quiet fractured into low murmurs, people leaning toward each other, repeating the words in softer tones, as if confirming them would make them more real. The woman holding her phone lowered it just an inch, her expression changing from detached observation to something closer to concern. The man near the curb straightened, his folded arms loosening, his stance no longer passive. Marcus did not react the way they expected. He did not speak. He did not correct. He did not claim anything. He simply stood there, the same as before, steady, present, his gaze level, his breathing unchanged. The name meant something to the people around him. It clearly meant something to Hayes. But to Marcus, in this moment, it did not change what had already happened. Hayes finally shifted his weight back, a small step that created space where there had been none before. The flashing lights still moved across his uniform, still reflected off the badge, but the certainty that had defined his earlier stance no longer held the same shape. He glanced briefly toward the crowd, then back at Marcus, as if recalculating something that no longer aligned the way it had seconds ago. The radio at his shoulder crackled again, but this time, the sound felt distant, less urgent, like it belonged to a different moment entirely. The night air moved through the space between them, carrying a faint breeze that lifted the edge of Marcus's hoodie just enough to remind him that the world was still moving, even if this moment had paused. Hayes lowered the identification card, slightly, not returning it yet, but no longer holding it as if it was the only thing that mattered. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, less rigid, the edge softened in a way that could not be undone. "Is that true?" he asked, though the answer was already in his hand, already in the name he had read twice. Marcus held his gaze, not with defiance, not with pride, just with the same calm presence he had maintained from the beginning. "My name is Marcus Reed," he said simply. Nothing more. No explanation. No defense. Just the truth, exactly as it had been from the start. And in that moment, the weight of everything shifted, not because of who he was connected to, but because the truth had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The shift did not come with a sound, but it was felt in the space between them, in the way Officer Hayes's shoulders lowered just slightly, in the way his grip on the identification card loosened as if the weight of it had suddenly changed. He looked at Marcus again, not as a match to a description, not as a situation to control, but as a person standing in front of him, calm, composed, unchanged despite everything that had just unfolded. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, but they no longer felt as sharp, as urgent, as they had moments before. Hayes inhaled slowly, the breath measured, as if he was recalibrating something internal that had been running on instinct alone. The crowd remained still, but their presence had shifted too, the earlier tension replaced with a quiet expectancy, as if they were waiting to see whether this moment would be acknowledged for what it had become. Hayes extended his hand and returned the identification card, the motion deliberate, careful, not rushed. "All right," he said, his voice lower now, the authority still there, but no longer edged with the same certainty. "You can go." The words landed softly, almost too lightly for everything that had led up to them. Marcus took the card, his fingers brushing against it for a brief second, grounding himself again in something tangible. He did not move immediately. Instead, he looked at Hayes, not with anger, not with relief, but with something quieter, something steadier. Hayes held that look for a moment longer than expected, then added, "I appreciate your cooperation." The pause before the words mattered more than the words themselves, as if they had not come easily, as if they had to pass through something first before being spoken. Marcus nodded once, a small acknowledgement, but he did not respond. He did not need to. The truth of the moment did not require anything more. Hayes shifted his stance again, stepping back another inch, creating space that had not existed before, his presence no longer pressing forward but holding still, uncertain for the first time. The radio at his shoulder crackled again, but he ignored it, his attention still fixed on Marcus, as if trying to understand something that had not been clear before. Around them, the murmurs began to return, soft and low, people releasing the breath they had been holding, their voices carrying fragments of what had just happened. The woman with the phone lowered it completely now, her expression thoughtful, almost conflicted. The man near the curb shook his head slightly, not in disapproval, not in approval, just in recognition that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Marcus slid the identification card back into his wallet, then into his backpack, each movement slow, deliberate, the same as before, the same careful control he had maintained from the beginning. When he finally stepped back, it was only one step, but it marked a boundary that had not existed minutes earlier. Hayes watched him, not stopping him, not questioning, just watching, the certainty that had defined his earlier actions now replaced with something quieter, something closer to reflection. And in that space, under the fading pulse of red and blue light, the moment settled into something deeper than resolution, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Marcus stepped away from the curb and onto the sidewalk, the distance between him and the flashing lights growing with each quiet step, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, like everything else he had done that night. The air felt different now, cooler somehow, as if the tension that had filled it minutes ago had thinned out, leaving behind something lighter but not entirely gone. Behind him, the patrol car remained where it was, its lights still casting red and blue across the pavement, but the intensity had faded, no longer centered on him, no longer defining the moment. He adjusted the strap of his backpack slightly, the familiar weight settling against his shoulder, grounding him again in something simple, something normal. The street stretched ahead in long, quiet lines, streetlights casting their steady glow in warm yellow pools that felt more real than the harsh flashing colors behind him. He passed the same storefront windows, the same closed signs, the same reflections, but everything felt altered in a way that did not need explanation. Not because the street had changed, but because he had moved through something that could not be undone. Behind him, Officer Hayes remained still for a moment longer than necessary, watching as Marcus walked away, the distance growing not just in space, but in understanding. The identification card no longer in his hand, the radio at his shoulder still crackling with distant voices. Everything about the scene had returned to routine except for the quiet weight settling in his chest. He exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more than fatigue, more than the end of a long shift. It carried something closer to realization, something that did not come with clear words, only a lingering question that refused to fade. The crowd began to disperse, one by one, their footsteps soft against the pavement, conversations low and fragmented, each person carrying away their own version of what they had seen. The woman who had been recording slipped her phone into her pocket, her expression thoughtful, her silence speaking louder than anything she might have said. The man near the curb turned away, shaking his head slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition of something that should have been simple and was not. Marcus did not look back. He kept his eyes forward, his pace unchanged, the rhythm of his steps matching the quiet beat of his breath. When he reached the corner, he paused briefly, waiting for the signal to change, just like he had done earlier that night. The crosswalk light flicked from red to white, the small illuminated figure stepping forward, and Marcus followed, moving across the street with the same calm certainty he had carried from the beginning. Above him, the sky stretched wide and dark, the city lights reflecting faintly against it, steady and constant. There was no applause, no confrontation, no final words spoken into the night. Only the quiet continuation of movement, of breath, of life returning to its ordinary rhythm. And in that silence, in the space left behind where tension had once lived, something remained, something unseen but unmistakable, like a truth that did not need to be spoken to be heard.